I just want to start this evening by sharing a little bit about a film I watched a few months ago. It's a film called Hacksaw Ridge. Anyone seen Hacksaw Ridge? No, that's fantastic. Nobody has seen the film. Great, you're all in the same boat. I watched Hacksaw Ridge a few months ago. I think it's probably one of the best films I've ever saw in my life, okay? And I'm not exaggerating there. It is a fantastic film. It's based on the true story of a guy called Desmond Doss, a 25-year-old American guy who decided to join the army in the Second World War. Now, the only difference between Desmond Doss and all the other people who were joining the army was that Desmond Doss, he was a Christian, but not only that, he was a pacifist. He was a pacifist who was joining the army to fight the Second World War. You think, okay, how does that figure? But basically, he wouldn't shoot a gun and he wouldn't hold a gun. So basically, he was there, he's in basic training, and they get the rifles out to teach the soldiers all how to use the rifles. He says, I won't hold one. I won't hold a gun. And right throughout his training, he refused to hold a gun. Now, his fellow soldiers who were all training really didn't like the fact that they're going to have a guy in their ranks who will not have a gun. He's going to let them down. He's not going to be able to look after them. He's not going to be able to be there shoulder to shoulder. So they really persecuted him right throughout their basic training. They punched him. They beat him up. They really verbally abused him the whole way through the basic training. He had a real hard time. But he stood firm and he said, no, I will go to war. I will go to the Second World War with these guys because I want to fight for my country, but I will not shoot a gun. So they made him a medic and they sent him with his company of soldiers to Okinawa, which was an island that was occupied by the Japanese forces. And his company of soldiers were sent to Okinawa to take Okinawa. And basically what they were tasked with was getting up this ridge. There's a 70-foot, it wasn't really, it was a cliff really, a 70-foot high cliff. And they had these ropes right to the top. And at the top were just all these Japanese machine guns and positions. What they had to do was his company of soldiers had to climb up these ropes right to the top of the ridge and charge the Japanese soldiers. So they did that. His company of soldiers, they all climbed up this 70-foot cliff, up these ropes and charged the Japanese position. But they were so entrenched, they had machine guns everywhere, that loads of the American soldiers in his company were killed and wounded, and they were driven back. And the order was given for them to retreat. So they retreat, they all run back, and Desmond Doss is there, and he gets to this ridge, and all his other soldiers are climbing back down this big rope ladder that goes the whole way down. And he's basically, what he does is he rescues one of his buddies who gets injured. And he's dragging his buddy back to get away from the Japanese soldiers to get down this ladder. And he's there, right at the top of the cliff, just about to go down the ladder. And he's there on his knees in his dirt, holding his buddy. And his friend just dies in his arms. He breathes his last breath, just covered in blood. He's been shot a number of times. And Desmond Doss, he's just sitting there with this friend of his. He's just died in his arms. And he just looks up to God and he says, God, what is it you want of me? What is it you want of me? And then he says, I don't understand. I can't hear you. And then, just a few seconds after he says, I can't hear you, he hears in the distance. He hears in the distance. And then he says, what does he want of me again? And he hears in the distance this soldier shouting, medic! I need a medic! And he looks back up to God and he says, okay, I hear you. And all the soldiers are climbing down this ladder. They're all retreating. And he turns around and he runs back into no man's land, the inferno, through the smoke and the bullets and the guns and everything, and runs and finds this injured soldier who's calling for a medic, dresses his wounds, sticks him on his shoulder, and brings him back. And he ties a rope around his waist. He's the only American soldier on this ridge now who's not injured or dying, lowers this guy down the ridge to the bottom where the medics are waiting for him to take him to the hospital. And then his hands already started to bleed because he's lowered this guy down on this rope, right down this ridge. And then he just looks up to the Lord and he says, Lord, help me get one more. And he runs back out into the inferno again, rescues another injured soldier, brings him back, lowers him down this ridge again. Again, his hand's bleeding. He's injured. He's struggling. And then he prays, Lord, help me get one more. Help me get one more. And he did that all night. almost killed numerous times, had to hide under dead bodies to stop the Japanese getting him. All night he did that. The American field hospital couldn't work out why injured soldiers were coming to their hospital all night. And it wasn't until the next morning that someone had to drag him off the ridge. And he'd saved the lives of 75 soldiers. He dragged 75 soldiers off that ridge. And these were all the soldiers who had beaten him up and persecuted him because he wouldn't carry a gun going into the war. And I remember watching that soldier, and I'm telling you, like, it was a tearjerker. You know, I don't cry much in films, but I was like, oh, it really did get me. And I remember watching that film and thinking, what an incredible example of costly love. You know, like, he almost died saving those soldiers. You know, he's so exhausted he could barely stand up afterwards. And you know, this evening, that's what I want to talk about this evening. I want to talk about costly love. Love that costs you something. Love that makes you risk something. That's costly love. And so this evening, I want us to look at a pretty famous story that Jesus told in the Bible, which is about costly love. And he told this story in response to some questions he was asked by a Jewish lawyer one time in the Bible. And it's probably one of the most famous stories Jesus ever told. I'd be surprised if any of you have not heard this story before. But it's a story that I always find really challenging to me personally, because it's a story that always makes me take a real long, hard look at myself, about what I'm about and what my priorities are. So let's read this story together. It's in Luke chapter 10, verse 25 to 37. Luke 10, 25 to 37. Verse 25 says this. On one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, he asked, what must I do to inherit eternal life? What is written in the law, he replied. How do you read it? He answered, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. You have answered correctly, Jesus replied. Do this and live. Now, let's just pause there. Now, the man here should have known that what Jesus just said was impossible. Why? Because, well, we're all born with this defect called sin that prevents us from loving God with all our heart, soul, strength, and mind. And rather, we love other things more than God and love ourselves more than our neighbors. And it's as if Jesus is kind of saying to this man here, okay, you want eternal life? Okay, well then jump over this 50-foot fence. So the man should have known, I can't do that. That's impossible. And then asked, so Jesus, how can I get to heaven? And Jesus would have said, hey, well, you know what? You've come to the right place. It's through me. But instead the lawyer thought, okay, love God means to keep the law. I've got that one nailed. What I need is some clarification on exactly who is my neighbor and who isn't my neighbor. And once I know that, I can make sure to love them as myself, and then, hey presto, I'm in. That's what the lawyer was thinking. Which is why we read verse 29. He wanted to justify himself, so he asked Jesus, and who is my neighbor? And what he's doing, he's hoping Jesus is going to give him like a pretty manageable list of who is and who isn't his neighbor. But instead, Jesus tells him a story which goes like this. Verse 30. A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and sent him away, leaving him half dead. Now, the thing you should know about robbers in the Middle East back then, robbers only beat their victims if they resisted. Okay, if they didn't resist, they just stole the stuff and left them. So obviously this guy has resisted. That's what he's made the mistake of doing. Now, it's also worth saying that the injured man in this story is assumed to be a Jew. Okay, now, even though that's not stated, he's assumed to be a Jew. So that's good to bear in mind as we keep going. Verse 31 continues. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. Now, just to say on the priest here, now, if you were a priest back then,
Well, you obviously worked in Jerusalem because that's where the temple was. Now, what happened was most priests back then actually didn't live in Jerusalem as well. They actually lived in Jericho, which was 15 miles away. And what they would do is they generally would do 2-week shifts at the temple in Jerusalem at a time. So this priest is probably on his way home from his 2-week shift at the temple. Okay, so that's what he's doing. Now, let's just park that. Another thing. So back then in Israel, the way you worked out someone's ethnicity was 3 ways. Their language, which language they spoke, their accent, and their clothes, how they dressed. Those were the 3 ways you worked out what ethnicity someone was back then. Okay? Now, problem. This man who the priest comes across, this wounded man, is unconscious and stripped naked, okay? So there's no way of this priest working out what ethnicity this guy is, okay? He's got no clothes on. He's unconscious, so he obviously can't speak, and obviously because he can't speak, you're not going to work out what his accent is either, okay? So the priest he's like, is this guy Jewish? I don't know. Now, if this guy who was lying here was a foreigner, the priest by law didn't have to help him out. But if he was a Jew, the priest would have had an obligation to help him. But because he was unconscious and stripped, he had no way of working out if this guy was a Jew or not. Right? Also, he couldn't tell if this guy was dead or not. If he was, and the priest touched him, he would be made ceremonially unclean and he would have to cancel his time off at home and immediately go back to Jerusalem for a week-long process of ceremonial purification. He did not want to do that. Okay? Now, if he had to do that, in that time, he wouldn't be able to eat the temple food, which was his livelihood, and neither could his family. So the priest decided it wasn't worth the risk. And he passed by on the other side of the road. And you know what? When you hear all that and you put yourself in the priest's shoes, sometimes we can look down on the priest and think, oh, I wouldn't have done that. Would you? I think if some of us are honest with ourselves, we'd have justified it just like that and we could have walked past just the same. Verse 32, so too a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. Now, Levites also worked at the temple. They're kind of like the assistants to the priests. Now, the Levite probably knew the priest was ahead of him, and he thought, well, priests know the law really well about what they're supposed to do and what not supposed to do. So there's probably a really good reason why this priest didn't help this guy. Okay, that's what the Levite's thinking. He knows best, so who am I to go against this priest? Okay, he knows best. And also the Levite probably would have been thinking, if he had helped this guy, it would have made the priest look bad. And he didn't want to make the priest look bad. That's going to make his job very hard when he goes back to the temple, making a priest look bad. You know, imagine he rides into Jericho with this injured man over his donkey, the same guy who the priest had ignored. That's going to make the priest look really bad. So with all that in mind, he passes by on the other side too. And then verse 33, but a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity, or had compassion on him. And he went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine, which is what they used back then to clean wounds. Then verse 34 continues. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. Now, back in this time, inns were found in towns and villages, not in the wilderness. You know, they were in settlements. And there's no archaeological evidence to suggest there was an inn between Jerusalem and Jericho at this time. So the listener of the story would have expected the Samaritan to take the man down to an inn in Jericho, which was a Jewish town. Now, Jews, I'm sure a lot of you know this, Jews hated Samaritans. So a Samaritan would not have been safe in a Jewish town, especially with a wounded Jewish man over the back of his animal. So it was very risky for the Samaritan to take this man to an inn. Now, if you know anything about Samaritans and Jews, the Jews, as I mentioned earlier, they hated the Samaritans. And basically, how this all came about, I think we've got a map here. So you see this area of Samaria, about 500 years odd before Jesus, the Assyrians invaded this area here, this northern part of Israel, and they took loads of Israelites and took them away into other lands. And what they did was they brought in foreign peoples and they put them in this area. And what happened was these foreigners, they married with the Israelites that were left. And what they did was they kind of merged the Jewish religion with all these other religions. So that these people became the Samaritans. So the Samaritans weren't foreigners. The Samaritans were like half Jew, half something else. Their religion was half Jewish, half something else. So they only believed the first 5 books of the Old Testament. They had their own temple on Mount Gerizim. They were kind of half in, half out. And that's why the Jews absolutely hated them. Samaria in Jesus' time was also a place of refuge for outlaws. So if you did something wrong in Judea, you could run to Samaria and they couldn't get you there. Okay, there's tons of reasons why the Jews hated the Samaritans. Another one is when Nehemiah, in the book of Nehemiah, when Nehemiah is trying to rebuild the temple walls, the Samaritans were the ones who tried to stop them. So there's tons of stuff right throughout history is like, that's why the Jews hate the Samaritans. So the Samaritans, they're the enemies, okay? And Jesus gets this story and he says, no, the Samaritan's going to be the hero in this story. And the Jews are like, what? What's going on here? But that's what he does. So this Samaritan, who the Jews hate, and as all Jews listen to this, risks his life bringing this Jewish man to an inn in Jewish territory. And the next day, he took out 2 denarii, which we're told is 2 days' wages. So I don't know what that is, but 200 quid. It depends on what you earn, really. But something, let's imagine it's 200 quid. It's a substantial amount of money. And he gave this money to the innkeeper. Look after me, he said, and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have. So the Samaritan, he pays the bill. Now, this is important because people who couldn't pay their debts back then were sold into slavery, okay? They were sold into slavery. You know, you didn't just go to CAP or ask some debt advice. You were sold into slavery. That was it. So if this Samaritan didn't pay this man's debt, if he didn't leave money for him, he may as well have left him on the road because he was going to be sold into slavery. But after he pays the bill, he still has to escape the town. This Samaritan guy. Now, the story's kind of left open-ended. Was this Samaritan, was he beaten by people in the town? Was he killed? Did he get out? We don't know. But what we do know is that what he did was incredibly loving, incredibly risky, and incredibly costly. Those 3 things, incredibly loving, incredibly risky, and incredibly costly. And then Jesus comes in right at the end with the now pretty obvious question. Verse 36, which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? The expert in the law, well, he can't answer anything else, can he really? The one who had mercy on him. It's interesting. He hates the Samaritans so much he can't even bring himself to say the name Samaritan. He just says, the one who had mercy on him. And Jesus told them, go and do likewise. Go and do likewise. So Jesus tells the lawyer through this story that your neighbor is anyone in need. Anyone in need, regardless of language, religion, or ethnicity. Anyone in need, even your worst enemy. And the Samaritan shows costly love, and Jesus says, go and do likewise. So question is, how do we go and do likewise? How do we show costly love to our neighbor? Well, I think the first step in showing costly love to our neighbor is stepping out of our comfort zone. Stepping out of our comfort zone. So my wife Elizabeth is a counselor. She's always really big on confidentiality, so she'll never tell me who she's meeting with or what she's doing, all that kind of stuff. So she's really big on that. But one time, a couple of months ago, she just came in and she'd been meeting with, she'd met with a couple of clients, and she just said, you know, Andy, there's a lot of suffering in this world. Now, she didn't elaborate, she didn't say anything more about it, but I assume what she was meaning was, I've just met with 3 or 4 people and they've shared how they have just suffered tons in life. That's I'm assuming what she was meaning. And the reality is there is a lot of suffering in the world. There's a lot of suffering in the world. And naturally, we want to protect ourselves against that suffering. So what we do is we make a space in our life where we feel safe, where we feel comfortable, our comfort zone. Now, I love being comfortable. Anyone else with me on that? Yeah? I love being comfortable. It's all right. This isn't a trick question. I'm not going to shame all people who like being comfortable after this. I am with you. I love being comfortable. I love sitting on my sofa at home, drinking a big cup of tea, feet up, watching something on Netflix. Anyone else like doing that? Yes, you're with me. Maybe Prime. I don't know what else you watch. But I love lie-ins. I love lounging around. Who loves that? Yes. Yeah, I know that. You may not do this. I love lounging around in my red jogging bottoms. I have these red jogging bottoms. They've got holes in them. Elizabeth won't let me leave the house in them. They really are not good. But I love sitting in them. Really comfy. I put slippers on. I have slippers and I wear them. I love doing that. I love all these things. I love hanging out with Elizabeth, my wife, and Max, and meeting up with friends for coffee. I love all these things. And you know what? There's nothing wrong with any of these things. But what Jesus is telling us here is every now and again, I want you to step out of your comfort zone and do something a bit risky for me. Every now and again, I want you to step out of your comfort zone and do something a bit risky for me. And the phrase we use as Christians for this is taking a step of faith, which is just another way of saying doing something risky for God. That's what the Samaritan did, and Jesus says we should do the same. You know, I was reflecting just recently about the fact that, just thinking about what I pray for. I was just thinking about a lot of the things that I've prayed for recently, and I realized that so many of the things that I pray for are motivated by the desire to stay comfortable. So many of the things I pray for are motivated by the desire to stay comfortable. I often pray stuff like, Lord, help me have a good day. Lord, I pray this meeting goes well. Lord, help me have a nice evening. And I was thinking this week, what if I prayed less about being comfortable and more about stepping out of my comfort zone? What would happen? Scary thing to pray, isn't it? What might happen? There's a song I used to love listening to when growing up. It's called The Sunscreen Speech by Baz Luhrmann. I don't know if you've heard of it. Now, the song's just full of advice on how to live life. And there's this line that I always remember in the song. It's this. It says, do one thing every day that scares you. Do one thing every day that scares you. And basically what he's saying is doing something every day that scares you. That's a healthy thing. That's a healthy thing. That's a thing that's good for you. And doing something risky, that's risky for God, it can be scary, but when you do it and it pays off, it can really, really, really strengthen your faith. It can really strengthen your faith. I remember the first time I walked up to some people on the street and offered to pray for them. This was a big step for me. It was in quite a Muslim area of Leicester, and I was going out with a group of other Christians, and my goodness, I was so nervous. I was so nervous. Not showing it, typical, bravado. You nervous, Andy? No, I'm all right. I'm ready for the street evangelism. No problem to me. I'm on this. I was all like bravado, but I was so nervous inside, sweating, everything. And we parted up in twos, and we saw this guy sitting on a wall, smoking a cigarette, waiting on his car to be washed. So we just walked up to him and said, hey, can we pray for you for anything? And he said, yeah, go on then. And he named 3 or 4 things he wanted prayer for, and we prayed for him, and then we just had a great chat to him about Jesus, and then we walked on, and it was a great chat, great time of prayer, and I was just like, wow, that was so cool! Just walking up to a complete stranger, praying for them, sharing the gospel with them, and it was fantastic. It was great. Now, I was buzzing after that. I really was, and we shared with a few other people. Now, I'm never going to be a street evangelist. I'm never going to be that guy out there all day, every day, sharing the gospel. But just taking that step out of my comfort zone, it really strengthened my faith. It really did something inside of me. And we all know the story, I'm sure, of Peter walking on water to meet Jesus. But I know this is a real simple thing to say, but before Peter walked in water, he first had to step out of the boat. he first had to step out of the boat, not really knowing what was going to happen, but he did it. It was scary at first, but he did it, and an amazing thing happened. He walked on water. And I just want to ask, when was the last time you did something for God that scared you? When was the last time you did something for God that scared you? I think there are many Christians today who feel stagnant in their faith precisely because it's been years since they stepped out of their comfort zone for the Lord. One of the best ways to grow your faith as a Christian is to just step out of your comfort zone. So I just want to ask, how could you do that this week? How could you step out of your comfort zone this week? I was going through this sermon, reading through it this afternoon. And I just felt God say to me, I just had that real strong sense. When you have a sense and you think, sometimes you think, is that God or is that not? And then sometimes you just get it and you just know, yeah, that's God right there. And I just felt him say to me, Andy, well, go on then. Are you telling everybody to step out of their comfort zone? Well, go on then. Why don't you just do it? Tom's getting worried now. He's like, what's he going to do? What's he going to do? You're all intrigued now. But yeah, I just felt God say really clearly, Andy, just step out of your comfort zone. You do it. And I was like, well, what do you want me to do, Lord? He says, just sack off the rest of your sermon. He didn't say sack him. That's me paraphrasing. But he said, don't end your sermon. And I'm thinking, I've got two really good points to finish off with. Like, I've got a quote in here from Mother Teresa, and like, really, it's going to blow your socks off. Like, I've got a really good way of getting to Jesus at the end. Like, technically, like, the rest of this sermon is like as technically good as you can get it. And that's what I'm thinking. Like, God's spoken to me. I'm like, but Lord, come on. This is really good what I've got here. And he's like, no. Come on, step out of your comfort zone. Don't finish it. Just leave it on this. Just leave it with people. Step out of your comfort zone. And I just said, Lord, well, okay, Lord, I won't finish the sermon, but so instead of practicing, I just set it aside. And I just took some more. I just prayed to the Lord. I said, Lord, if I'm not finishing this, you want me to step out of the comfort zone? Do you want me to just stand here? It's like, what do you want me to do, Lord? And I said, what do you want me to do, Lord? And I just sat in silence. And I just prayed, Lord, I can't hear you. I mean, if there's something you want me to do, I can't hear you right now. And just at that moment, the walls are really thin between our house and next door. And next door, they have a little 2-year-old. And just at that moment, the 2-year-old just started to cry really loudly. And I could just hear this little 2-year-old crying really loudly for about 10, 20 seconds. And then you could sort of hear thud, thud, thud. Mum or dad comes and comforts the little child. And I really just felt like God was saying that there are some of us here tonight who things look good on the outside, but on the inside, you're crying out. You really are crying out. And I just felt that God wanted to say, if that is you, that he is your comforter and he will comfort you. Like that mom, that dad who came and comforted that little girl. So that's what I've sacked off my sermon for. I just felt God wanted me to say that. And I said, Lord, if there's anything else you want me to share, is there anything else you want me to bring? I mean, I'm going to have loads of spare time, so Lord, I can bring some words, but it's risky when you bring words and there's only 15, 20 people because you can't play the odds game. If there's 600 people, someone's going to have a sore arm, Lord. But 15 or 20, Lord, you're going to have to nail this. This is going to have to be you. And this whole stepping out of our comfort zone thing, I think God is speaking to us about this. I feel God does want some of us here to actually do that, to just step out of their comfort zone. Like whatever it is, whether it's just sharing your faith with that person at work, like just actually boldly, not even waiting for an opportunity, just go and do it. I feel there are some of us, and actually God's saying, I just want you to just do it. Like the Nike advert, just do it. So I feel God is speaking to some of us about just stepping out of our comfort zone, whether it's sharing our faith, whether it's going to another country, whether it's doing something that is completely out there. I feel He's saying, come on, let's step out, let's do it. And just as I prayed, I felt God say that, there's stepping out of your comfort zone, is like going and doing something. Yeah, I feel God saying He wants us to do that. But there's another thing of sometimes allowing God into an area of our life that He hasn't been in before, or that we guard from Him, is another way of stepping out of our comfort zone. You know, some of us, often we can have those areas of our lives, areas of our hearts where, we're like, no, God, you don't come in here. No, this is mine. And I feel God says, I want in there. I want all of your heart. I want every bit of it. Don't bar off bits. And I just had this image of just a door and God knocking on the door. He's knocking on the door. He wants to come in. He wants to come into that area of your life that you've held off from Him.